Bet you guys didn't see this one coming as early as it did, if I can get it out as early as I hope to and ADHD burnout doesn't get to me. Yeah, it just so happened that I got done listening to all the albums for this video pretty early, so to help alleviate some of the stress when we get to other year-end videos that I have to do, I thought I'd just film this now and try to get it out a little early. That way it's just kind of off my chest and not an extra stressor on top of other things that I'm working on. Also, I'm sorry my hair looks kind of a mess right now. I don't know what is happening, and I was gonna wear a hat, but I'm gonna be filming for a long time between this video and another one I'm doing, so just embrace whatever the fuck this is. Anyway, welcome back to 10 Years Later, the series where I talk about albums from the 2010s that were either impactful to me, impactful to music in general, very popular, or just worth revisiting 10 years later for good or bad reasons. That is the old intro, right? I've forgotten at times because it's been so long since I've done this series, so I hope I got that right. Either way, you see the title, you heard me say it. Today, I want to talk about 2014. As always, I put a picture here for whatever reason. So usually in these videos I talk about what the landscape of music looked like at the time before I get into the actual albums themselves, but this time around, don't be surprised if the intro is a little shorter and I don't talk as much about what sounds were popular or things like that. I just don't want this intro to go on forever. Last year's video was 45 minutes and someone told me they were discouraged by the length, so I'm gonna try to do what I can to make this one at least a little bit shorter. Here goes nothing. So, I think I said this in one of my videos recently on my favorite games of a given year. But a lot of times when it comes to judging how good or bad a year is in music, just like in gaming, a part of me thinks a lot about the vibes of that year. I know that can only get you so far, especially if you weren't there at the time, if you weren't really living through it, but for me, I guess it's just a thought. With that in mind, the vibe of 2014 as a year in terms of albums and music is a weird one. Coming off a year like 2013, which was loaded not just with quality, but with quantity in terms of albums, 2014 was a lot quieter. This year, I listened to 36 albums that had come out in 2014, which is a far cry from the 40 to 50 plus albums that I had heard in 2011 through 2013. Only 2010 had less albums, and even then, 2010 still felt kind of exciting because I distinctly remembered a lot of the albums that were coming out in 2010 because they were noteworthy or influential. Basically, let me frame it like this. I've always mentioned that I didn't really start listening to albums until I started reviewing them, which was in 2017. Thus, I've missed out on a lot of albums and rollouts and musical happenings over the years, which is partially what inspired this series, a desire to catch up on what I had been missing. However, throughout previous years, there was still an era of, oh yeah, I remember this era, as we now call album cycles, eras, either because of others around me listening to the albums, remembering a lot of the big hits, or just being kind of aware of some of the events surrounding the rollouts. When it comes to 2014, though, I don't really have as much of that. Very few of the albums that came out in 2014 that I went back to for the series had me going, right, I remember how big that was in 2014. Maybe that's just me, you guys might be different, but just I didn't notice it quite as much. Now, as far as quality goes, despite the smaller sample size, we did have a fair few really good albums, and on a personal level, there was quite a bit that I enjoyed in 2014. Of course, there were quite a few albums that I kind of just shrugged at and said whatever to, but most of those came from artists who I forgot even put out albums, so it's probably for the best that they walked away with nothing more than a shrug, as opposed to a facepalm or a head shake. To give the breakdown of the 36 albums that I reviewed in 2014, I gave 10 excellent ratings, 3 great ratings, 6 good ratings, 4 okay ratings, 1 bad rating, 2 awful ratings, and 10 ratings that were some modicum of Now, of course, we're not going to talk about every single album in this video, and you won't know every single rating just from this video, but all in all, not a bad distribution there. Again, a fair few albums that were just kind of shrug-inducing, but roughly 53% of the albums got at least a good rating, so there was more that I liked than disliked. Plus, only 8% got a negative rating from me, so that's not that bad. Decent blend of stuff I enjoyed too. A fair few hip-hop albums, some R&B sprinkled in there, and even some pop music that's largely had a pretty deep personal impact on me. But before we get into my favorite albums of 2014, let's get into my least favorites. These are albums that I would have given an awful rating to in a full review, and thankfully there's only 2 here, so not going to be nearly as much bad this time around. So let's blow through them to get out of the way, starting with the number 2 least favorite album of 2014, and this one kind of makes me sad to talk about because it's an artist that I love and respect heavily, especially after this year with something that they specifically released, but I still didn't like this album very much at all. I gotta go with Pharrell Williams' album Girl. Let it be known, as if it isn't already known, Pharrell is a legend, and it definitely pains me to kick off the least favorites list, or duology rather, with one of his albums, especially after watching the Piece by Piece documentary that came out over this past month, which was incredible. I highly recommend it. But unfortunately, yeah, this album was just really hard to get through. It felt like Pharrell was at such a commercial high point between Get Lucky and Happy becoming such major hits, and he just kind of wanted to cash in on those to massively diminishing results. When listening to this thing, I had found some of the falsettos a bit annoying, and even if I've kind of softened on that point with a re-listen, I still think the writing is pretty gross at different points of the album, and there were quite a few songs that felt like they just went on too long. It says something that a year before this, Justin Timberlake dropped 2 albums with songs that went on for 6, 7, 8, and even 11 minutes that didn't feel like they lulled nearly as much as the songs on this project. Also, since it was the big single, re-listening to Happy did make me lose my mind. I had like a 10-minute breakdown afterward because I was too busy laughing at Happy, 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 Happy. I don't think it's a bad song technically speaking, it is just shockingly annoying. Yeah, this album was pretty bad, but honestly to me, it's barely a blip on Pharrell's career. I mean, he made No One Ever Really Dies after this. This is honestly nothing. Oh, and again, like I said, watch Piece by Piece, the new documentary that he just put out. It's a beautiful documentary, even if you're not really into documentary films. I highly recommend checking it out. Definitely gave me an even greater appreciation for Pharrell and the legacy he's left. A legacy that I don't think is tainted by this album, even if I didn't really like it. And again, getting through the negative pretty quickly, my least favorite album of 2014. This one's probably not going to be very surprising to a lot of you guys, but yeah, it's my least favorite. It's probably some of your least favorite too. I gotta go with Maroon 5's 5. V5. It's pronounced 5. Okay, so I know that Maroon 5 gets a bad rap from a lot of people, myself included, for basically being a generic pop music AI machine factory type thing. But even with previous albums that I've reviewed from the group, I didn't find them to be agonizingly bad. Even 2012's Overexposed was more just kinda bad as opposed to being like absolutely abhorrent and rage-inducing. And 2010's record Hands All Over was actually not that bad at all. But 5 on the other hand was where I found the group to really fall down the hole. It's kinda sad because a lot of the big singles from the album like Maps, Animal, and Sugar, which are front-loaded on the record, are at least fun kind of bad. They're not good, but they're goofy enough to kind of go along with and joke about. I mean, again, while listening, I did make my jokes about a track like Animal with the "Pray on you dead," or that random part where he just goes, "Ow!" And as much as the song annoys me, it is funny when I hear Sugar, because it just, my brain just goes, "Sugar!" and so those are fun bad, but then tragically the album remembers that it's a Maroon 5 record, and then it stops being fun bad and just becomes bad bad. It gets so generic so fast, and nothing else even reaches the level of cheesy and stupid that the singles reach. I'd honestly say this is probably the worst Maroon 5 album I've heard, which is saying something given what would come after this. If nothing else, Red Pill Blues and Jordy have a single or two that I've actually kind of gotten behind, but this? Nope, not in the slightest. This was the beginning of the downturn for the group, though again, we'll have time to get into that much later in this series. But yes, that's all of the least favorites, so now let's jump into the favorites, and don't be surprised if the descriptions on these aren't super long, it's just that there's 10 here, so I don't want to spend forever talking about these records. Again, don't want to bloat this video out too much, especially because I have more to talk about after the favorites list. So let's jump in, starting at the number 10 spot, a record from an artist that some of you might be surprised to see me rank this high given how hard I've gone on his recent music, but I gotta go with PARTYNEXTDOOR's PARTYNEXTDOOR 2. Again, if you've been keeping up with my shorter reviews, you might be surprised to see an album like this land in my favorites list, given that this very year I reviewed PARTYNEXTDOOR's latest album and found it to be really bad and even got a pushback comment or two from it. But the truth is, I do like P&D's older stuff quite a bit, and P&D 2 is a great example. It's definitely that kind of spacey R&B that he's well known for, but it feels like the music that he was putting out in this era had so much more character and personality to it than what he puts out now. It almost feels like the only lesson that he took from his older stuff when creating his new stuff was spacey, and that's it. Nowadays, his stuff feels so much more slow and kind of boring that this feels like such a breath of fresh air in comparison. But yeah, even with his modern music being pretty bland, I would say, older P&D is quite the vibe, and P&D 2 is a perfect example of that. A lot of songs I still love going back to from this album, and it makes for a very enjoyable record. But what's this I'm hearing that he's supposed to be putting out a collab project with Drake this year? Sorry, but I think that would have been a better idea 10 years ago, guys. You might have missed the boat. At number 9, one of the many debut albums that's on this list, or in this video rather, gotta go with Logic's Under Pressure. Mostly because I got into Logic with some of his later records, I never really got to listen to his first 2 iconic albums, but Under Pressure, his debut, has long been held up as one of his best albums. And rightfully so, because it's very good. Listening to it for the first time, this version of Logic is to me the best version of Logic, the one that I enjoy the most. Just rip-roaring through playful and clean flows without trying to rap too fast, while also managing to deliver very genuine introspective storytelling that isn't trying to be more than what it is or coming across full of itself. I mentioned that last part because it is something that Logic kind of struggles with on some of his weaker albums, trying to be a little more conceptual but just not quite sticking the landing. But here, that's not a struggle at all. This is just Logic just at his absolute best in terms of performances, with great production to back him up, and it makes for a very compelling record. And it was even cooler getting to go back to this project this year, given that Ultra 85 finally came out this year and was awesome. Getting to see how Logic has grown and even kind of calling back to this record on Ultra 85 was great. And as up and down as his career has been, and as inconsistent as his discography has been, this record still hits. Really, really good album. At number 8, of course, a personal pick. Granted, every album in this video is a personal pick when you really think about it, but I gotta go with Ariana Grande's My Everything. One of the few albums from 2014 that I listened to and reviewed before this year began, and in a way, I can acknowledge that My Everything was not super adventurous as a quick follow-up to Yours Truly, and that might have turned some people away from it, but you know what? I just love Ariana's music, and this is a record that has too many songs on it that I absolutely adore. Matter of fact, the bonus track Only One might actually be my favorite Ariana Grande song. It's so underrated, and I wish it got some kind of single push because I feel like it would have been a hit. Maybe I also feel that way because I wasn't as crazy about some of the album's bigger singles like Problem and Bang Bang, though through no fault of Ariana herself. I don't think that she was the problem with those tracks. Still, plenty of songs on here that are among my favorites from Ariana, and I have to give this album some credit because it was through the song Love Me Harder that I first learned who The Weeknd was. And obviously many of you know this, but he's become one of my favorite artists and one of my biggest inspirations, so in that regard, thank you, Ariana. But yeah, still love this album, and even in 2014, a time when I was still trying to break out of the I don't like any kind of music that's popular phase of my life, I've always loved Ariana's music. It might not be one of her absolute best, but I think that's more of a testament to how many good albums she has. At number 7, certainly one of the more popular albums of 2014, one of the most remembered, and one that is very well received. Gotta go with J. Cole's 2014 Forest Hills Drive. This was one of the last albums I listened to from 2014 this year, and it was certainly one that I was interested in because of all the positive talk I had heard about it. Maybe a lot of that was the whole double platinum with no features joke, though I have heard a lot of general love for the record, so I was definitely interested. And yeah, after listening to it, I really did dig it. I understand that Cole is not everyone's cup of tea, and that some people find him as a performer and a writer and a lyricist to be a little bit basic. On a personal level, I wouldn't say he's like my GOAT or anything like that. But this record does have quite a few of his most iconic songs, and following his career arc up to this point, after hearing his first few records, I feel like this was the point where he really came into his own as a performer and had some of his best production to date. I wouldn't say it's like my all-time favorite album, but it's the kind of thing that I can turn on and thoroughly enjoy whenever I listen to it. Although I say this half jokingly, but the closing track, Note to Self, almost made me drop my rating for this album from an excellent to a great. Cole doesn't even rap on the song. It's a 14-minute track where he's just talking the whole time and giving out thank yous, including to some random celebrities who apparently he hadn't even known at the time. Like, I get it. It's a nice gesture and it's very sweet, but J. Cole, have you never heard of liner notes? I know he said he didn't turn them in on time, but dude, move the album back a week or whatever to get them in. Come on. Okay, in all seriousness, great album. Very much enjoyed it. What the hell was J. Cole doing on 7 Minute Drill earlier this year? At number 6, keeping in the hip-hop world with another record that is very well liked from 2014, I gotta go with ScHoolboy Q's Oxymoron. Funny story, the day I listened to this album for this video was February 1st, which was the same day that Q announced this year's album, Blue Lips. And I listened to it before the announcement came out, so I'm not gonna say I did that or made it happen, but you're welcome. Anyway, I was really looking forward to checking this album out because I had been hearing it was one of ScHoolboy Q's best records, if not his absolute best. And yeah, I definitely see why. It's as dark, gritty, and hard-hitting as you'd expect a gangsta rap album to be, and it was easily Q's best showcase of his talents, technicality, and skill as a rapper. Great set of features on here too. He even managed to swing features from Corrupt and Raekwon on this thing. Damn good pulls there. Definitely a fantastic album, and honestly, listening to it in a year like this actually felt kind of awesome in hindsight, because again, it's still a peak album in ScHoolboy Q's career, and then he would go on to drop Blue Lips this year, which was fantastic and also stands among his bests. So it's cool to see not only that this album still delivers, but that 10 years later, he's still at a top level as far as quality is concerned. At number 5, this one was a bit of a funky one in terms of how it was released and what it was, but I gotta go with Childish Gambino's Stone Mountain / Kauai mixtape / EP. This was one of the more interesting finds as far as 2014 records were concerned, because I had known about this record for quite a bit because Sober has always been one of my favorite Gambino tracks. It was actually the first Childish Gambino song I ever heard, and that song is on Kauai, but this was a strange double release for Gambino, one part of which is not on streaming services. Stone Mountain seems to have a few too many samples that were uncleared, hence why it wasn't reissued. And because of that, only Kauai can be found on streaming services. I still seeked out that side of the project alongside Kauai and listened to them both, and I love them both the same. Stone Mountain basically has the feel of like an Atlanta-style rap mixtape, which Bino obviously dominates on, and Kauai goes for more of a tropical-influenced R&B sound, which is great because personally I've always enjoyed what I call R&Bino, so that side of the project was always going to be exciting for me. And as a whole, even with two entirely different styles, this is an extremely strong and cohesive record that I greatly enjoyed. It's crazy to see how much he's grown even since this, which I think was evidenced by Bando Stone in the New World, which he dropped earlier this year. If that is truly the last Gambino album, what a discography that Donald Glover has built for himself. At number 4, I feel a little weird putting this record this high up given the person who made it, but I do enjoy the music quite a bit. I gotta go with Trey Songz' album Trigga. It does always feel a bit weird to me when I'm putting Trey Songz' music so high on these lists, because truth be told, he's done some kind of gross stuff. That's exactly why when the series was individual albums and I looked at 2010 albums, I didn't do an individual video on Passion, Pain, and Pleasure, even though I absolutely love that album. It helps that it was especially potent then to not make a video on them because the allegations were still pretty fresh when that album celebrated its 10th anniversary. But Trigga is a record I really love, and it's got a lot of tracks I love going back to. I've said it many times before, but I'll say it again. I love R&B, and Trey Songz was the king of it for a good portion of the 2000s and 2010s, before his career started to kind of go down. This album in particular was also super versatile, and Trey did really well with a lot of styles, and obviously he's an incredible vocalist, so he nails it there all throughout the album. It's a really great album with several songs that I absolutely adore. If only Trey Songz didn't give me the ick these days. At number 3, very much a personal pick. Again, I know all of them are, but still, very much a personal pick, and one that I know some people will say, you're putting too high, but this album just has too much personal impact on me. I gotta go with Ed Sheeran's Multiply. Another album I had already listened to and reviewed before this year began, and look, again, I know the look that some of you are giving to me right now. It probably looks like this. Or something like that, like the DreamWorks face or something. And I get it, there are probably several 2014 albums that many of you would put ahead of this one, and I get it that Ed is largely seen as being basic, but you know what? I can't lie. I like some white guy with a guitar music every once in a while. And like I said, this record has too much of a personal impact on me. I'm sure I won't be the only one to say this, but even though it wasn't the first full album I had listened to from Ed Sheeran, the big hits from this record were what turned me into a fan of his. I always thought he was a great vocalist, and his writing at least had some more depth than what you might expect from the typical white guy with an acoustic guitar type of music. Plus, there are some classic ballads all throughout this record that I still go back to very often. Objectively, is it the best thing to come from 2014 musically speaking? No. But in my entirely personal video of my favorite music from 2014, is it one of my favorites? Yes, it is. And it's one of those records I could always go back to and enjoy. At number 2, perhaps the biggest record of 2014 in terms of pure commercial success, and maybe one of the biggest records in recent memory in terms of commercial success, I gotta go with Taylor Swift's 1989. I mean, yeah, I'm not gonna make a joke like I did in the 2012 video, but I am using the Taylor's version cover because of course I am. But yeah, I listened to 1989 for the first time fully last year with this re-release, so listening to it again for the series was going to be a breeze. Plus, even though it's long, I didn't mind doing it through Taylor's version because I love the vault tracks from this re-release. All of them are among my favorites in Taylor's vault. But vault tracks aside, this was probably the one album from 2014 that I can truly say, oh yeah, I remember when it was making the rounds. Because even as someone who wasn't listening to albums at the time, this thing was practically unavoidable in 2014 and 2015. I actually remember even before listening to the record fully, I was kind of into it because I remember really loving Kurt, Hugo Schneider, and Sam Sui's 1989 medley that they did. As I was slowly opening up to more popular music, I watched a lot of Kurt and Friends back in the day. So when I finally heard the record in its entirety, I was familiar with even some of its deepest cuts, but all in all, it was an amazing album. This was Taylor's full, no-holes-barred transition into pop as opposed to mixing pop and country, and much of the album is pretty much pop perfection. It does have a few of my least favorite Taylor singles like Shake It Off and Bad Blood, but the rest of the album is Taylor at her best vocally, writing-wise, and production-wise, and those weaker singles are balanced out by some of my favorite Taylor singles, like Blank Space and especially Style, which even before I was truly a Taylor Swift fan was always one of my favorite songs from her. It's easy to see why this has had the impact that it has, because it's still a fantastic record, and it's by far one of my favorites in Taylor's catalog. And again, those vault tracks on the re-release. Woof! But as much as I love it, there is still one record that goes ahead of it, and it's not technically an album, it's a mixtape, but this one is fantastic. Many of you, by the fact that I just said mixtape, probably already know what I'm talking about, so let's just say it. My favorite record of 2014, I gotta go with Mac Miller's Faces mixtape. I actually missed this when it got re-released on streaming services a few years back, but this was a record I was very much looking forward to experiencing, given all of the talk that I was hearing about it beforehand. And yeah, it's by far one of Mac Miller's finest projects. I believe I talked a bit about this in last year's video when I was talking about Mac's 2013 album, Watching Movies with the Sound Off, but it felt like after his frat rap beginnings with his Kids mixtape and Blue Slide Park, Mac really moved into more abstract styles and definitely jumped into more introspective writing, and I feel like this project was the culmination of that and the artistic growth that he had shown. I love how the production feels so psychedelic and jazzy, and I feel like Mac himself was just at his most fearless and most creative between his performances and his songwriting, mixing nicely between fun wordplay and very emotional storytelling as well. There were quite a few tracks that I kind of listened to and had one of those moments where I went, damn. This project really did something for me, and I know it's done something for a lot of people. You can obviously tell that by the amount of excitement that there was when it got reissued on streaming services a couple years back. Given how often it feels like mixtapes get lost in the sands of time, or dat piff, it makes me happy that this project has gotten released on streaming services because it's truly a special tape and a crowning moment in Mac's discography. R.I.P. Mac Miller. A shining star gone far too soon. So those were my favorite albums of 2014, but we're not quite done yet because there are still other notable albums worth talking about from the year. These ones I will definitely try to rapid fire through even faster, so let's not waste any more time because this video has gone pretty long. Let's just jump into the miscellaneous albums. I feel like this album goes a bit underrated compared to Kid Cudi's others, but honestly, I thought that Satellite Flight: The Journey to Mother Moon was pretty good. Obviously, it doesn't come anywhere close to the iconicness of the Man in the Moon trilogy, or the quality of it, but it's actually a pretty nice vibe while it's on, and it's better than you might expect given that no one really talks about it. I might also say that despite Cudi having the Man in the Moon trilogy, this record to me feels like his most space-sounding record, and I like that style a lot. Not his best work, but a very enjoyable one. Not looking forward to finally hearing Speeding Bullet to Heaven for the first time next year. Rick Ross put out 2 whole albums in 2014, and I barely remember either of them. That's kind of a feat in and of itself, honestly. To be fair, I did listen to the track In Vain from Mastermind a hell of a lot this year, but let's be real, that's mostly because of The Weeknd. Either way, yeah, Rick Ross made 2 Rick Ross albums, and they both sounded like Rick Ross albums. Neither of them seemed to take too many steps outside of his comfort zone, so if you were tired of his style by this point, avoid these like the plague, but if you still loved his style, these were for you. Both had a scattered highlight or two, but neither was terribly interesting to me, and in the case of Hood Billionaire, I felt like his actual rapping took a huge step back. I really liked his 2010 album Teflon Don, but I feel like I'm not really gonna vibe with another project of his quite like that one. Hey, remember when Iggy Azalea was like one of the biggest artists in the world for like a whole 10 minutes? Yeah, that was a time. In all seriousness, I went into this thing not certain what I was gonna get, and I mean, it wasn't terrible. If anything, my biggest issue with it beyond Iggy's voice when she raps, which is incredibly annoying to hear, is just that the record feels extraordinarily generic. I didn't really hear it and think, oh, this is so horrid. It just kind of went in one ear and out the other. Though, to give it some credit, it was this record that introduced me to Charli XCX, so yes, Queen, Skinny Legend, Versace, Boots the House Down, Slay Queen, Hunty Mama, and Oop Daddy Work, Charli XCX, Snatch My Wig. Yeah, that's it. This is a weird situation to be in. Future released 2 full-length projects this year, an album and a mixtape, and one of them was clearly more well-liked than the other, yet it turns out the one I liked better was the one that others didn't like better. For whatever reason, Honest hit pretty hard for me, and I think it's because, as someone who wasn't super familiar with Future's old music, it was wild to hear him going so hard on this album performance-wise. Like, hearing the way he went off on songs like Move That Dope, Covered in Money, and especially Shit, was so shocking to me because I'm so used to Future just being kind of cold and, for lack of a better word, boring sometimes. But here, he's really ripping shit, and I was super surprised. Now, Monster, on the other hand, didn't really do as much to me for whatever reason, even though that's hailed as one of his best projects. Like, it's technically solid, but it didn't really excite me in the same way that Honest did. Though, to be fair, maybe it's because after the We Don't Trust You duology, Honest, Mixtape, Pluto, and now Monster, this being the 5th Future record that I listened to this year, yeah, burnout probably just kicked in pretty hard. Looking back, this was by far the strangest album that I listened to in 2014, and honestly, trying to listen to Michael Jackson's Escape gave me a bit of a headache. It's another Michael Jackson posthumous record that came 5 years after his death, just really ringing that cow out, huh? But the deluxe edition, which is the version that's on Spotify, has 2 versions of every song on it. Essentially, the base album was 8 previously unreleased songs kind of contemporized for a modern audience, but the deluxe edition had the original versions of those songs as well, so I couldn't decide how to listen to the album. In order, side to side, to compare the 2 versions, it was weird. But as far as the quality, even though it was controversial, I think the 2010 posthumous album that was just titled Michael was better than this. Like, I can give this credit because at least unlike that record, it sounds like every song here was actually sung by him, but One of the few albums from 2014 that I'd already listened to and reviewed before this year, Sam Smith's In the Lonely Hour is one of those records that I have quite a soft spot for. It's exactly what you expect it to be, but Sam's voice is honestly angelic, and they made some really beautiful ballads on this album that I still go back to quite a bit. I do think Sam's trajectory after this has gone very up and down, even though I've mostly enjoyed their albums up to this point. Though I do understand that they probably just didn't want to be pigeonholed into being the sad ballad singer. They probably just wanted to try to explore new things, and I get that and I respect it. With that said, this is still one of my favorite records that they've put out, with The Thrill of It All still being my number one. Obviously, throughout the series, we get plenty of artists who drop an album as I have a 10 years later album to talk about. That's a given. I mentioned it with ScHoolboy Q. But little did I think after talking about The Hunting Party that Linkin Park would suddenly make a comeback. With that said, as of the filming of this video, the album's not out yet, so you'll have to wait to hear my thoughts on it. Now, this album, The Hunting Party, is pretty good. Not Linkin Park's best work, but it was still a good time. I think that trademark throbbing energy that Linkin Park is known for was definitely on display quite a bit here, and there's just enough experimentation to keep this from being just another Linkin Park record. Definitely not one of the group's best, but still a very enjoyable album. I feel bad saying this, but I've resigned myself to the fact that I'll just never get into Lana Del Rey as much as everyone else does. Every time I listen to one of Lana's records, I walk away just being like, wasn't really for me. And Ultraviolence is another example of that. And I feel bad saying that because I know that she's super popular and super influential, but while I see the appeal of her music, something about it has just never really done anything for me. I feel like it's one of those weird things where I enjoy some of the artists she's influenced a bit more than I enjoy her own music. Like, she's had a huge influence on a lot of artists, but I feel like I enjoy those artists that she's influenced more than I enjoy her music. Sorry, Lana fans. Coming off an album as good as Control System and hearing so many mixed things about this record, I went in not sure what to expect out of Ab-Soul with These Days, but after listening to it, I honestly enjoyed myself a solid bit with it. There was more that I liked than I didn't like on the album, and it made it worth the listen in the end. I do understand the perspective I was hearing that Solo might have been trying to get a little too commercial at some points on the record, but I think his ever-solid rapping abilities and the enjoyable features still made the project worth listening to. Definitely not his best, but all in all, a pretty good record. Before Sia was out making one of the most tone-deaf movies in recent memory and antagonizing several of her fans on Twitter, she was on a short but notable run as one of the most popular artists in the music world, having had her big breakthrough with some of the hits off of 1,000 Forms of Fear, which I once mistakenly thought was titled 1,000 Layers of Fear. Oops. Even so, I do think this is a good album, even if it's not one of my favorites or anything like that. It had some nice soaring and unique electronic pop songs that certainly stood out among what was popular on the radio at the time, so I'll give it that, and I'll stand by that Chandelier is one of the most misrepresented pop songs I can think of. It's a song about alcohol addiction, but it's used in a lot of happy commercials. How does that happen? But it's still a very good song, and the album itself is good. But she still made that movie, so. Fitting to talk about this project because this year, Days Before Rodeo by Travis Scott finally got reissued on streaming services, which was quite a big musical moment in 2024. I finally got to listen to it for the first time as a result, and yeah, it's pretty good. I don't absolutely love it, especially compared to some of Travis Scott's other work, but there's quite a bit to like here. I think it was a good showcase of Travis as a producer and the kind of things he could do sonically, even though it did still sound like he was trying to find his footing and his sound a little bit. It was a good blueprint of what Travis would eventually grow into a year later when he would drop Rodeo. But more on that then. Hey, remember when Apple thought it would be fun to just drop this album on everyone's iPhones out of nowhere? Yeah. That was stupid. Though honestly, it's the most interesting thing I could say about the album because it's not that interesting otherwise. Moving on. People who constantly comment on my other Chris Brown 10 Years Later videos and think I'm a hater, spare me for a moment. I don't hate this album. In fact, I actually think X is pretty okay. It's not amazing, but it's by far the most I've enjoyed myself with a Chris Brown album up to this point. Again, I don't think it's a great album, and I honestly don't think Chris will ever be able to have a truly great album until he can actually edit himself and stop bloating out his track list so much. But relative to what he normally puts out, X actually has some of his better and more catchy and memorable music in my opinion, and it definitely feels a lot more focused than other Chris Brown records that I've heard. And after 2 straight albums of generic dance pop, it was nice to see him embrace the R&B side of things a bit more here. I think that's what really kept me in its corner to some extent. I still have my qualms with Chris Brown as a person, but at least he made a pretty okay album here. Another album from a great artist who was just getting their feet off the ground in 2014, Venice was Anderson .Paak's debut album, and while it's not quite as beloved as his other stuff, I really liked it. Had it not been for the fact that the album cooled off a little near the end, it could have gotten an excellent and landed on my proper favorite albums list for 2014. Nevertheless, it was a great showcase of Paak's mixes of hip-hop, soul, and R&B, with plenty of really good high points. I think he would obviously go on to refine these sounds a lot on future records, but even going back to this one was plenty of fun, and I could definitely recommend it. Remember when Nick Jonas went and did his own thing and for a hot minute was actually pretty successful on the charts? Yeah, that was fun. But yes, I did check out his self-titled debut album for this series. I think it was a debut album, I'm not 100% sure actually. And it was okay. I definitely get a bit of wannabe Justin Timberlake out of at least a few moments on the record, but all in all, it had a few good hits and Nick had some very good vocal charm. And honestly, Jealous was a song I looped a lot back in 2014, 2015, and I still enjoy it now, even if I don't replay it quite as often. Being completely honest, listening to this record felt a bit weird, and you know what's coming and why I'm saying that. But when I listened to this record for the series, it was the first time I listened to a 10 Years Later album directly following the passing of the artist, or in this case, one of the band members, who made the album. Obviously, I've listened to records from artists who have passed. I mentioned Mac Miller earlier, but this was the first time I did so in the wake of the artist passing. Yes, I'm going to address the elephant in the room because there was going to be no way around it unless I somehow got this video out a month or 2 ago. But many of you obviously are well aware of the passing of One Direction's own Liam Payne, news that I thought was fake when it had been sent to me in the moment. He passed on October 16th, and I listened to this album on the 25th, just over a week later. It was certainly strange to say that, and even now it's naturally pretty hard to process that he's no longer with us. But at risk of an awkward transition, the show had to go on, so I listened to 4, and I hate to say it, but I was honestly kind of indifferent toward it. Though honestly, that's through no fault of the boys. While I like their 2013 album, I've maintained that I feel like being on Psycho Music left them with so little creative freedom and led to a lot of their music having kind of stale and forgettable production, which I think happened here. The album does have one of my favorite 1D songs in Night Changes, but unfortunately that's about it. Though overall the record is obviously still great for the fans. And of course, R.I.P. Liam Payne. I know he was a complicated soul, but it's a shame his story had to end so soon. Given my contentious history with Nicki Minaj's music, I was praying that I would enjoy the Pink Print, given that I've heard some pretty good things about it. And thankfully, I did actually quite like it. I don't think it's an amazing record, and once more, I feel like Nicki's inability to self-edit and just release an album with a succinct, not overly long track list was her greatest undoing once again. But all things considered, I think this was a great combination of all of Nicki's sounds and styles, brought together in a very cohesive way with Nicki sounding among the most focused that she ever has. It's also nice that the record takes some personal detours as well that makes it feel like an album with a good bit of heart. Of course, I still think Anaconda is a weak single and only is a single that's hard for me to get through without bursting out in laughter multiple times. But this is definitely one of Nicki's best albums and a record I feel like she hasn't topped since. And who knows if she ever will. And last but not least, though I actually listened to the Pink Print after this one, Charli XCX had a huge 2024 with Brat and the whole Brat summer trend, and let it be known, be a spoiler for my year-end list, but as of right now, unless something really magical comes along, Brat is my album of the year. And as someone who hadn't really dug into her music before Brat, that album made me want to go back and marathon her other records. So naturally, I listened to Sucker for the series, though I didn't love it quite as much. It's got some fun bops. I think that Boom Clap is still a good single. And it's definitely interesting to hear Charli do some pop rock-esque songs, but as you might expect, the album does obviously give off the impression that Charli was still trying to find her footing a bit. Most of my time listening to this was going, wow, she's really grown a lot since this. Because obviously this compared to something like Brat is night and day. Still not a bad album, just a kind of okay one to me. But it's definitely not going to stop me from marathoning the rest of her discography later this year. Boots the House Down, Slay Queen. Oh, I already said the thing. I'm not doing it again. So yeah, that's 2014 as a year in music. Not the most albums I've had to listen to in the series, but a lot of really good ones that I definitely enjoyed quite a bit. And looking at the schedule for 2015, there's a lot of records from that year that I absolutely love, so that's another year I'm really looking forward to revisiting. But obviously, this was all just my opinion on 2014 as a year in music. What did you think of 2014? Was it a great year, a bad one, a forgettable one, a memorable one? What were your favorite albums from the year, your least favorite albums of the year, the ones you've gone back to the most? I know there are probably plenty that I missed, so what were some great ones that I missed? Whatever your thoughts, opinions, and experiences are, leave them down in the comments below. Let's keep this civil and have some fun as we like to do. If you guys want to hit like and subscribe and support some of my other ventures that I have linked in the description, thank you. If not, it's no big deal. I totally understand. And yeah, once I stop recording here, I'm going to do the next video in my favorite games series where I talk about my favorite games of 2017. And given that the raw footage for this video is already just under 55 minutes, oh boy, that next video is also going to be very long. So stay tuned for that, but until then, thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.